They said I was too old to hold her. My own granddaughter, pink and wrinkled and new, wrapped in a blanket I had knitted before she was even conceived, back when I still believed that love could be passed down, like family recipes or heirlooms, if you just tried hard enough. "You're too old to hold her, Mom," my daughter said, her voice thin, polite, clinical almost, the way a nurse might explain a restriction on visiting hours. She didn't meet my eyes. She looked at the baby instead, like I was invisible, like I was already gone. The room smelled of antiseptic and lavender lotion, that hospital-clean sweetness that tries to cover up everything human. I stood by the window, hands slightly raised, and then I let them fall. The silence was heavy, and the hum of the nursery monitor filled the space where her warmth should have been. I smiled, small and slow, because when you're 74 and you've spent your whole life teaching your children how to keep calm, you don't start shaking now, not even when they deny you the right to hold your own blood. I nodded, pretending it made sense, pretending I understood, because mothers like me have spent a lifetime pretending things make sense. I live alone now, in a small one-bedroom near the Montclair train station. The walls are thin and the floorboards complain when I walk to the kitchen at night. But it's mine. The kettle takes its time to boil, and the sound is steady, reliable, something to fill the spaces that conversation used to occupy. From my window, I can see the bakery across the street, where teenagers lean on each other, giggling through clouds of powdered sugar. And sometimes I think about how my daughter used to laugh that way, before her voice hardened into that polite, professional cadence people develop when they want to sound above needing anyone. I was proud of her once, still am in a way, but pride has teeth, and I learned too late that success and love are not the same species. When she first told me about the IVF, her voice trembled. It was a year after her second miscarriage, a year of sterile appointments, hormone injections, and hollow reassurances from specialists who spoke in percentages instead of comfort. "We've tried everything," she said. "This is our last chance, but we can't afford it." I remember sitting at my kitchen table, the phone pressed against my ear, staring at the thin stack of bank statements in front of me. $48,000. That was the number the clinic quoted. She said it softly, like she was confessing a sin. I could hear the quiet shame under the words, the humiliation of needing, the fear of asking. I told her not to worry, that I'd help, that mothers always help. I said it quickly, like ripping off a bandage, because I didn't want her to hear the tremor in my own voice. That money was everything I had left from Derek's pension, my safety net for the years when I wouldn't be able to stand all day or remember which pill was for the heart and which was for the knees. But she was crying, and all I could think was that maybe, if I helped her bring a life into the world, she would remember that I'd brought her into it too. The day I wired the money, I felt lighter, like purpose itself had returned. I ironed my clothes, made tea, even went out and bought a new notebook because I thought I might start writing again. I wanted to document it, the journey, the hope, the quiet miracle of modern science and maternal devotion. I thought it would be a shared story, something she'd tell the child one day. Your grandmother made you possible. I imagined holidays, birthdays, the way her little girl's hand would fit into mine like a continuation of something sacred. I didn't know yet that this story would turn into a record of erasure. During the months that followed, I wasn't included much. They said they were busy, that there were appointments, rest days, hormone treatments that left her exhausted. I sent messages, gentle, patient ones. "How are you feeling today?" Do you need anything? I made soup. I can drop it off. Sometimes she answered with a heart emoji, sometimes not at all. Erin, her wife, took over most of the updates. She's doing fine, just needs rest, she'd write, her tone efficient, distant. I could sense it even through the phone, the boundary forming, invisible but deliberate. The pregnancy became a private kingdom, and I was kept at the gate. I told myself it was natural, that new families needed space, that I had to be gracious, understanding. That's what mothers do. We rationalize cruelty, so it doesn't break the people we love. When the baby shower came, I wasn't invited. They said it was a small thing, just close friends, nothing fancy. But I saw the pictures online. My daughter in a pale yellow dress, surrounded by flowers and laughter, holding up tiny onesies embroidered with rainbows. I scrolled through the photos, counting faces I didn't know, and felt something small and cold settle under my ribs. Still, I sent a gift. A hand-stitched blanket, pale green, soft enough for a newborn's skin. No reply. No thank you. Just silence. When the baby was born, I found out from a group text. She's here. 6 lbs 8 Oz, healthy and perfect. A picture followed, her tiny face turned away from the camera, my daughter's hand resting on her chest. Erin's caption read, "Our miracle, our family complete." I stared at the words. Our family complete. There was no space for me in that sentence. I tried to be rational, to remember that postpartum emotions run high, that people need time. I waited a week, then another. Finally, after 4 weeks, I was invited to visit. The message was brief. If you want to meet her, come Sunday at 2. Please don't bring gifts. We have everything we need. I arrived early, of course. I always do. I wore my nicest blouse, the navy one with the pearl buttons that Derek had always said made me look like a woman who knows her worth. I stopped by the bakery and bought a small cake. Lemon, her favorite. When I reached their house, I could hear music through the walls, a cheerful playlist of children's songs. Erin opened the door. She smiled, polite but tight. "You made it," she said, as if she'd half hoped I wouldn't. My daughter was on the couch, the baby asleep on her chest. She looked tired, beautiful in that soft, exhausted way new mothers do. For a moment, my heart lifted. I reached out instinctively, hands trembling slightly. "May I hold her?" I asked. My daughter looked at me, then at Erin, then back at the baby. Her lips parted, and she said it. "You're too old to hold her, Mom." The words landed quietly, almost gently, but they cracked something open inside me. I thought I hadn't heard her right. I even smiled, waiting for her to laugh and say she was joking. But she didn't. She adjusted the baby's blanket and added, "Your hands aren't as steady as they used to be." Erin looked down, pretending to rearrange the flowers on the table. No one said anything else. I sat there for an hour, maybe more. I can't really recall the conversation. Something about sleep schedules, feeding times, developmental milestones. They talked like I was a visiting relative from another life, someone to entertain out of obligation. I smiled, nodded, said all the right things. "She's perfect. You're doing wonderfully. I'm so proud." When I left, Erin handed me my coat and said, "It's just a lot right now, you know? We'll be in touch." I walked home slowly, the cake still in its box. I placed it on my kitchen counter, untouched, and made myself tea. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing those words over and over. Too old to hold her. Not too weak. Not too sick. Too old. Like age was contamination. I used to think cruelty had a sound. Raised voices, slammed doors, the thud of something breaking. But sometimes it's quiet, polite, almost kind. Sometimes it comes with a smile and the word Mom attached. I sat at my table until dawn, the room dim except for the light over the sink. The kettle whistled softly, a reminder that I was still here, that time still moved. I thought of the years behind me, of every sacrifice neatly folded into my daughter's life. The unpaid bills, the extra shifts, the holidays spent alone so she could travel. I thought of the $48,000 I had wired without a second thought, the lifetime of labor it represented. And then I thought, maybe love needs receipts after all. When the sun rose, I pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write. Not a letter of anger, but a statement of truth. A record. A reckoning. Because if I didn't name what had happened, it would stay invisible, just like I'd become. And I was done being invisible. The thing about betrayal is that it never happens all at once. It begins with softness, with gratitude, even. The day I sent the wire transfer, my daughter's voice cracked with relief. "Mom, I don't know how to thank you," she said. I told her she didn't need to. That's what mothers are for. I was standing in the small branch office of my bank, the kind where they still offer coffee that tastes like cardboard and call you by name. The clerk, a young man with kind eyes, double-checked the numbers. "It's a large sum," he said cautiously, and I smiled, because that was the first time in months someone had reminded me that what I was doing was big, not just in amount, but in meaning. I signed the form and watched as my savings dissolved into a digital promise. $48,000 toward a future I believed I'd be part of. My hands didn't shake. My chest felt light. I remember thinking, this is what love looks like. Risk without hesitation. I left the bank with a printed receipt and the faint illusion of immortality. My name, my gift, my lineage, all now intertwined in the making of a new life. For weeks afterward, I lived in a quiet state of hopefulness. My daughter called me Mommy again, the way she hadn't since college. She sent photos of clinic hallways, pale blue gowns, ultrasound screens with blurry shapes. "It's early, but it's working," she'd say, her eyes shining through the phone. I printed the pictures and taped them to the refrigerator next to an old photo of her at age 4, smiling with missing front teeth. I liked the symmetry of it. The child who once grew inside me now growing a child of her own. I thought it was a circle, closing sweetly. I didn't know it was a door, quietly shutting. She started sending fewer updates as the months went by. When I asked about the treatments, she'd say, "Oh, everything's under control." The word control had a sharpness to it that made me uneasy. I offered to come to one of her appointments, to sit in the waiting room, bring snacks, keep her company. She hesitated. It's a lot, Mom. Aaron's there, and the doctor prefers minimal people." Minimal people? The phrase echoed long after we hung up. I began to sense that there was a new language between us, one where affection was rationed and access was managed like a privilege. When the embryo took, she called crying, voice trembling with joy. "It worked, Mom. It finally worked." I remember I sank into the nearest chair, dizzy with relief. For a few minutes it felt like we were whole again, mother and daughter on the same side of something miraculous. "You made this possible," she said through tears. "You gave us this chance." I clung to that sentence as if it were a medal pinned to my chest. I replayed it later, over and over, because it was the last time she said thank you. The pregnancy became a timeline of quiet exclusions. I would find out milestones through social media before hearing from her directly. 12 weeks today. Baby the size of a lemon. Halfway there. The captions were cheery, the photos perfectly curated, but I could tell which parts of the picture were missing. No mention of me, of the woman who had mortgaged her safety to buy that smile. Once she sent me a picture of the nursery, pale wood furniture, a moon-shaped nightlight, an expensive rug that looked too soft to step on. "Isn't it beautiful?" she wrote. I replied, "It's perfect. I can't wait to see it in person." She never answered. I tried to convince myself she was just tired. I told my friend Marjorie that it was normal, that new parents get wrapped up in nesting. Marjorie looked at me with pity and said, "Honey, she's nesting in a house you built." I laughed it off, but something inside me tightened. When she hit the 7th month, I asked if she needed help setting up for the birth. I could come for a few weeks, I offered, do the cooking, the laundry, stay out of the way. She hesitated again, said she'd think about it. A few days later, Erin called instead. "We've decided to hire a postpartum doula," she said briskly. "It'll be easier for everyone." Easier for everyone, except me, I thought. But I said nothing. I'd grown skilled at swallowing words before they turned into weapons. I told myself I'd be invited once the baby came. They'd need me then. They always had before. The birth announcement arrived by text on a Friday evening. "She's here. Healthy. We're exhausted but happy." No photos, no invitation to visit, just that sterile line. I called immediately. No one answered. I left a voicemail, soft, careful, filled with pride. "I love you both. I can't wait to meet her." I waited all weekend. Nothing. On Monday, I got a reply. "Still adjusting. Maybe next week." I bought a small plush bunny, wrapped it in tissue paper, and placed it by the door, waiting for the call that would never come. It wasn't until 4 weeks later that I finally stood in that living room, holding my breath, staring at the child I had helped create. And in that moment, when my daughter stepped back and said I was too old to hold her, something in me went silent. Not broken, just emptied. Like a jar that had been poured out until there was nothing left to give. I nodded, said I understood, and sat quietly while they talked around me. I remember tracing the seam of my skirt with my thumb, an old nervous habit, just to keep from trembling. Every word they said afterward, about feeding schedules, sleep patterns, the baby's temperament, felt like a language I no longer spoke. When I got home that evening, I set the bunny on the kitchen table and stared at it. It looked ridiculous. Soft pink fur, floppy ears, a tag that still read, "Welcome to the world." I realized I didn't know what world I had welcomed her into. Not mine. Not one where love was an instinct instead of a transaction. The next morning, I gathered the papers I still had from the bank. The transfer receipt, the clinic's invoice, the confirmation email with the total sum. I laid them out like evidence, proof of my own sincerity. I wasn't planning revenge. I just needed something tangible to remind myself that what I'd given was real, that I hadn't imagined my part in this story. It was only later, when I told Marjorie what had happened, that she said, "You should ask for it back." I laughed at first. "You can't invoice love," I said. She looked at me sharply. That wasn't love. That was payment for erasure. The sentence landed harder than she meant it to. I went home, poured a glass of wine, and stared at the stack of papers. Somewhere between anger and disbelief, a strange clarity settled in. Maybe love, once denied, becomes debt. Maybe I'd been paying interest for years. I spent the next few days replaying every conversation leading up to the birth, searching for the moment I'd agreed to disappear. I couldn't find it. There was no single act, no dramatic rupture, just a slow reclassification of who I was, from mother to provider, from person to function. They didn't mean to be cruel, I told myself. They were just protecting their version of family, one where the past didn't intrude, where aging wasn't a mirror they had to look into. Still, understanding didn't ease the sting. The turning point came 2 weeks after that visit, when my daughter called, not to apologize, but to ask if I could help with the baby's insurance paperwork. Her tone was brisk, almost professional. "You're good with forms," she said. I almost laughed. I told her I'd think about it, and when we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and looked again at those receipts. My name was there, printed neatly under payer. It was such a small word, but it contained my whole role in her life. That's when the idea formed, not out of spite, but out of logic. If I was the payer, then maybe it was time to send a bill. I didn't sleep much that night. I drafted the letter carefully, like a lawyer might, though I had no legal training. I itemized the expenses, included dates, amounts, confirmation numbers. At the bottom, I wrote, "Reimbursement requested due to breach of trust and exclusion from intended family role." I didn't know what that meant exactly, but it sounded official, almost righteous. Then I printed it, folded it neatly, and slipped it into an envelope. The act felt strangely peaceful. I wasn't angry anymore, just awake. The next morning, I walked to the post office, the envelope tucked under my arm like something sacred. The air was cool, and the sky hung low, heavy with rain. At the counter, the clerk asked if I wanted tracking. "Yes," I said. I wanted proof that it had arrived, that my absence, at least this once, would register somewhere official. When I dropped the envelope into the slot, I felt the weight shift. Not lifted exactly, but redistributed, like finally setting down a bag I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. On the walk home, I thought about the word she'd used, old. I repeated it in my mind until it lost shape, until it became something almost beautiful. Old enough to know the cost of silence, old enough to understand that sometimes the only way to be seen again is to make a little noise. The morning after I mailed the letter, I woke before dawn, not because of nerves exactly, but because the body develops its own rituals of survival after years of being ignored. The light hadn't yet filtered through the blinds, and the world outside was still half asleep, the kind of quiet that feels like forgiveness. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I had signed the wire transfer papers almost a year earlier, and stared at the marks the coffee mugs had left on its surface. Rings of history, faint but permanent, proof that something had once been warm here. I thought about the letter on its journey through sorting centers and conveyor belts, about some postal worker in a fluorescent vest scanning the barcode without knowing he was handling a piece of my dignity. I didn't regret sending it. What unsettled me was the stillness that followed, the absence of immediate consequence. I had expected some explosion, a phone call, a text, a confrontation. But silence is its own kind of violence, and I had lived long enough to recognize it. 3 days passed before my daughter called. Her voice came through the receiver taut and brittle, the sound of someone balancing on the edge of their own self-image. "Mom," she began, "I got your letter. What is this supposed to be?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "It's exactly what it says. A request for reimbursement." There was a pause, then a nervous laugh. "You can't be serious." "I am," I said, and for the first time in months, I didn't soften my tone. She started talking quickly, words tumbling over each other, about stress, about how I was embarrassing myself, about how Aaron thought this was all a cry for attention. "You think money will fix this?" she asked finally, her voice trembling with that particular brand of outrage that only the guilty can afford. "No," I said. "But it might remind you that my kindness wasn't a blank check." She hung up without another word. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was clean. By that evening, I knew the letter had done its work. Aaron called next, polite but icy, the kind of voice that made small talk sound like cross-examination. "This is very upsetting for her," she said. "She's postpartum. She's fragile. You're making things worse." I wanted to ask whether fragility excused cruelty, but instead I said, "If she's fragile, maybe she shouldn't build her strength by breaking her mother." There was a sharp inhale, and then Aaron said something that stayed with me far longer than it should have. "You're not part of this family anymore, Martha. You chose this path." I almost laughed. Chose? As if erasure had been my hobby, my leisure pursuit. I didn't respond. I simply said, "Then please ensure the check is made out correctly," and ended the call. I set the phone down and waited for the shaking to begin, but it didn't. There's a steadiness that comes when you finally stop defending yourself to people who have already decided what you are. The next few weeks unfolded like a slow unraveling of everything I had assumed about loyalty. Friends called to say they'd heard from my daughter, frantic messages about how I was not well, how I was confused, how maybe it's time she took over my finances. It was a careful campaign designed not to confront, but to contain. She wasn't punishing me outright. She was reframing me. I had gone from benefactor to burden in less than a season. People asked careful questions. Was I eating well? Had I been sleeping? Did I have anyone checking in on me? It's extraordinary how quickly society accepts the narrative of an older woman's instability, how easily authority shifts from the one who gave life to the one who claims to manage it. I didn't defend myself. I let the rumor bloom. I had learned that truth requires patience. Lies die of starvation when you stop feeding them. Still, the nights were long. I'd sit by the window with my tea, listening to the trains in the distance, imagining where they were headed. I thought of leaving sometimes, of packing a small suitcase and taking the first train to anywhere, like I used to dream of doing when I was young and life still felt elastic. But I didn't go. I wanted to stay, to see how far this silence would stretch before it snapped. The only letter that came in those weeks was from the IVF clinic, a bland statement showing the payment had been processed in full and without refund eligibility. I stared at the words and wondered if that was how my daughter thought of me now, non-refundable. The first escalation, though, wasn't in words. It was in absence. She stopped calling altogether. No birthdays, no check-ins. Weeks turned to months. My friends stopped asking about her because they could no longer bear my rehearsed optimism. I busied myself with small projects, organizing photos, repainting a chair, learning how to cook for one without feeling like it was punishment. But quiet has a way of revealing the truths you've been avoiding. I began to realize that the real betrayal hadn't been the too old comment or even the letter ignored. It was the gradual rewriting of history that had taken place long before. She had always been good at editing. Her emotions, her memories, her version of me. I was the mother who worked too much, worried too much, loved too visibly. I was convenient when I paid tuition, when I babysat, when I helped her move apartments. But once she built the life she thought she deserved, She decided that the woman who had built her didn't fit the decor. One afternoon in late autumn, I saw her by accident. I was at the grocery store, reaching for a bag of apples, when I heard her voice 2 aisles over. That unmistakable tone, bright, performative, pitched for other people's admiration. I froze, an apple slipping from my hand and rolling under the display. When I turned, there she was, baby in the stroller, Erin beside her, chatting with a woman from their neighborhood. I could have walked away. I almost did. But something in me, the last stubborn remnant of pride maybe, made me step forward. She saw me before I spoke, and for a brief second, I saw panic flash across her face before she composed it into that public smile she'd perfected. "Mom," she said, as if I were an old colleague she'd run into unexpectedly. What a surprise. I looked at the baby, at the soft fuzz of her hair, at the tiny hand clutching a toy. "She's beautiful," I said softly. Erin adjusted the stroller, subtly angling it away from me. "Thank you," she replied. My daughter cleared her throat. "We should catch up soon." It was a lie, and we both knew it. I nodded anyway. "Of course. You know where I live." Then I walked away before my knees could betray me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch with the lights off, the apple from earlier still in my bag, untouched. I thought about how much of motherhood is an act of unacknowledged grief. Grieving the child you had, the child they become, the mother you were allowed to be before they outgrew their need for you. Around 2 a.m, I got up, turned on the lamp, and opened my notebook. I started writing, not to her, not anymore, but to myself. I wrote about the years of small silences, about the time she forgot my birthday, but remembered to tag a coworker in a post about women who inspire me. I wrote about the invisible tax of maternal devotion, how every act of love is recorded somewhere, even if no one else keeps the ledger. By the time the sun rose, I had filled 20 pages. It wasn't therapy. It was evidence. A week later, a letter arrived. Not from her, but from a lawyer. The envelope was thick, official, self-important. Inside was a printed notice requesting that I cease any and all claims of financial restitution and refrain from further contact until emotional conditions improve. Emotional conditions, I thought. They had turned my heartbreak into a diagnosis. I sat at the table, rereading the letter until the words blurred. There was a time I would have cried, or called, or begged for understanding. Not anymore. I folded the paper neatly, placed it in a drawer, and brewed myself a cup of tea. The kettle took its time, as always, hissing softly, steady, unbothered. It's a strange kind of freedom, the one that comes after humiliation. When you've already been cast as the villain, there's nothing left to lose by living honestly. I stopped checking my phone for messages. I deleted the photos from the fridge, every ultrasound, every baby picture I'd printed. I replaced them with postcards from places I'd never been: Lisbon, Kyoto, Vancouver. Small windows into lives that didn't revolve around being anyone's mother. At first, it felt like betrayal, then like breathing. I started walking in the mornings, long circuits through the park, where strangers greeted me with the kind of casual kindness that doesn't demand explanation. There was an old bench by the pond where I'd sit and feed the ducks, and sometimes I'd imagine telling one of them the whole story, just to see what silence without judgment felt like. When the refund never came, I wasn't surprised. I had stopped expecting decency from people who traded it for appearances. But something inside me had shifted. The letter, the confrontation, the legal threat. They had all stripped the illusion bare. I no longer wanted the money. What I wanted was acknowledgement, and since they wouldn't give it, I decided to give it to myself. I made copies of every document, every receipt, and placed them in a folder labeled Proof of Life. Not because I needed evidence for court, but because I wanted to leave behind a record that said, I existed, I gave, I mattered. Sometimes, late at night, I'd still think of the baby. I wondered if she would ever know the story. If one day she'd ask why there were no pictures of her grandmother, why no one talked about the woman who made her existence possible. Maybe she'd look for me, or maybe she wouldn't. Either way, I'd be ready. Because the next time someone told me I was too old to hold something precious, I'd know better. I wasn't too old. I was just finally done holding what didn't want to be held. The day I decided to move felt strangely ordinary. There was no dramatic epiphany, no storm, no slammed doors, only a slow gathering of clarity that had been building for months. I woke up to the smell of burned toast, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and a streak of light creeping through the blinds. The morning felt neutral, almost sterile, and yet something in it whispered that I couldn't stay in this version of my life any longer. The silence had become too sharp, every object in my apartment echoing with the weight of old meaning. The framed photo of my daughter holding her infant, the receipt folder tucked neatly into the drawer, the half-empty box of herbal tea she'd once recommended for my nerves. I made my coffee, sat down at the table, and stared at the faint stains from years of use. The surface looked tired, like me. I realized I'd spent most of my days lately waiting for the phone to ring, for an apology, a message, a sign that I still belonged somewhere. But belonging, I'd learned, is not a gift others can bestow. It's something you claim when you stop asking permission to exist. It started, I suppose, with the idea of leaving not to escape, but to breathe differently. I took the bus to the next town, just to walk among strangers who didn't know my story. There's something liberating about being unrecognized, about moving through a place where no one expects you to be anything. I wandered into a small park near the station, sat on a bench, and watched the late spring air carry small bursts of white petals like snow. 2 children were playing with a kite, their laughter rising and falling in the breeze. I hadn't heard that sound in my home for years, not since my daughter was small enough to believe the sky listened when she called to it. I stayed until dusk, then took the last bus back, feeling lighter but uncertain of what to do next. That night, I opened my laptop and looked up listings for shared housing. Most were too expensive, too cramped, too far. But one caught my eye, a single room for rent in a converted Victorian house. For a quiet tenant, no drama. That phrase made me laugh aloud, a deep, surprised sound that felt almost foreign in my throat. No drama. I applied immediately. The landlord's name was Joyce, a retired librarian with a sharp tongue and a soft heart hidden behind layers of skepticism. When I arrived for the viewing, she was standing at the door in a faded sweatshirt that said, "Don't talk to me before coffee." Her hair was the color of pewter, her glasses slightly crooked. "You the old lady?" she asked bluntly. "I suppose I am," I replied. She nodded approvingly. "Good. I don't rent to people who pretend to be young." Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and onions, lived in and unpretentious. The walls were lined with books, and a cat with a limp tail watched me from the stairs as though evaluating my worth. Joyce led me up to a small room with a slanted ceiling and a single window that caught the afternoon sun. It wasn't beautiful, but it felt real. There was a bed, a small desk, and a dresser with a missing knob. "It's clean," Joyce said, "and I don't care what you do as long as you pay rent and don't burn the place down." I handed her the envelope of cash I'd saved from selling my car, and she gave me a key without ceremony. "Kitchen's shared," she said. "I like quiet in the evenings. You snore, you're out." I promised I didn't, though of course I did sometimes. She shrugged. "We'll see." That first night, I slept better than I had in months. The air in the room was cool, and the sounds of the house, the creak of old pipes, the muffled hum of Joyce's television downstairs, felt like a heartbeat I could rest inside. When I woke the next morning, sunlight was spilling across the floor, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waking into loss. I made coffee in the communal kitchen, careful to use her favorite mug by mistake, a chipped one with the words, "World's Okayest Cook." She caught me in the act, raised an eyebrow, and said, "Well, at least you have taste." That was the closest thing to friendship we had in those early days. Within a week, I found a small cafe down the street with a handwritten sign in the window. "Help wanted, mornings." I hadn't worked in 15 years, not since I retired from the clinic, but I walked in anyway. The owner, a woman in her 40s named Heather, looked me up and down like she wasn't sure I was serious. "We open at 6, she said. "You sure you're up for that?" I smiled. "I've been up at 6 every day since the 70s. She gave me a trial shift. The next morning, I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing my best blouse and a pair of sensible shoes. The place smelled of burnt toast and coffee grounds. My hands remembered everything. How to carry 3 mugs at once, how to smile just enough to make tired people feel human again. By the end of the shift, my feet ached, but I felt solid, anchored, alive. When Heather handed me my first small envelope of cash at the end of the week, I almost cried. Not because of the money, it wasn't much, but because it was the first thing in years I had earned that didn't come with guilt attached. Joyce and I developed a rhythm. She didn't pry, and I didn't overshare. We ate dinner together sometimes, cheap pasta, canned soup, sandwiches that dripped mayonnaise onto the counter. She'd mutter about politics while I listened, nodding at the right moments. Occasionally, she'd laugh, a low, rasping sound that made the cat, Franklin, look up as if startled. I learned that she'd lost her husband a decade earlier, that her children had moved out west and rarely called. "That's the way it goes," she said once, lighting a cigarette at the kitchen window. "You raise them to leave, and then they forget to wave." We clinked our mugs in a silent toast to mutual abandonment. Work gave my days structure. I liked the small rituals, polishing the counter until it gleamed, refilling sugar jars, learning the regulars' orders by heart. There was a man named Arthur who came in every morning at 9, always wearing the same gray jacket. He ordered coffee with 2 creams and no sugar, and always tipped in coins. He told me he'd been widowed for 10 years and that the cafe was his excuse to see people without having to talk too much. One morning, after I refilled his cup without him asking, he smiled and said, "You've got the hands of someone who's worked hard." It wasn't flirtation, just recognition, and it made something inside me unclench. In that quiet, unassuming life, I began to rediscover pieces of myself I'd misplaced. The part that could laugh at bad jokes, that noticed the way sunlight glowed through the steam of a morning coffee, that took pride in simple competence. I stopped checking my phone entirely. Weeks passed without hearing from my daughter, and the ache began to dull, not because it mattered less, but because my life had grown around the wound like scar tissue. One Sunday, I took my first full day off and rode the bus to the coast. The ocean looked exactly the same as it always had, indifferent and vast. I walked along the shoreline, shoes in hand, the water cold against my ankles, and realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about her. I was just thinking. That realization frightened me a little, but it also felt like relief. When I came home that evening, Joyce was on the porch, a glass of cheap wine in her hand. "You look different," she said. "Good different." I told her I'd been to the ocean. She nodded. "That'll do it. The sea doesn't lie. It just keeps going." I laughed and she smiled, and for the first time in months, I felt a kind of peace that didn't depend on anyone else's forgiveness. That night, as I folded my uniform for the next day, I realized I hadn't thought about the money in weeks. I didn't care whether it ever came back. The debt had changed shape. It was no longer about dollars or justice, but about reclaiming the parts of myself I'd given away too freely. The woman who had written that letter, tight-lipped, trembling, desperate for acknowledgement, had been a ghost built from shame. The woman who ironed her blouse in a small rented room above Joyce's kitchen was someone else entirely, not reborn, not redeemed, but real. I didn't know it then, but that was the turning point, the quiet center of the story where grief began to transform into something sturdier. It didn't announce itself with fireworks or tears, just the steady rhythm of small steps taken in my own name. Every morning, as I walked to the cafe, the city looked different, though nothing had changed. Maybe it was me. Maybe freedom isn't a destination at all, but the slow, deliberate act of standing up from a table where you're no longer wanted and finding somewhere else to sit. The second wave didn't begin with a phone call or a letter, but with a shadow. I noticed it first in the way Joyce's cat would pause at the front window, tail twitching as if sensing a stranger outside. It was mid-autumn then, the air thick with the scent of rain and dying leaves, and the days had shortened into a kind of dusky melancholy that suited me. I had settled into my new life with the quiet discipline of a woman who had finally learned not to expect interruption. My mornings belonged to the cafe, my afternoons to long walks through side streets lined with cracked pavement and hydrangeas fading into brown. I was content in that modest rhythm, and it felt almost like forgiveness, until the past found me again, as it always does, when it realizes you've stopped thinking about it. It was a Tuesday, the kind of gray morning when the air feels undecided. Heather handed me a towel to wipe the counter, her usual sign that I'd done well enough not to get fired. The door chimed, and I glanced up automatically, expecting one of the regulars, but instead saw a young man standing awkwardly near the entrance, a familiar uncertainty in the way he clutched his phone. He looked about 20, maybe a little older, tall, with the kind of nervous kindness that makes you want to reassure him. When he finally looked up, I recognized him immediately. My grandson, Kieran. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The last time I had seen him, he'd been 12, lanky and shy, forever sketching in a notebook. Now he was a man, his face carrying faint traces of both his mother's defiance and my late husband's gentleness. "Grandma?" he said quietly, as if testing whether the word still belonged to me. My throat tightened. "Sweetheart," I managed, setting the towel aside. He looked relieved, almost childlike in the way his shoulders dropped. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me." I wanted to tell him there hadn't been a day I didn't want to see him, but words have a way of turning fragile under the weight of truth. So I simply nodded. "Sit," I said, motioning toward the corner booth. He sat. The cafe had emptied by then, and the only sound was the low hiss of the espresso machine cooling down. "They don't know I'm here," he said. I didn't need to ask who he meant. He looked down, fiddling with his cup. "Mom told everyone you were, well, that you needed space." I almost laughed, a dry sound that startled even me. "I suppose I took it." He smiled faintly. "I figured. I found your address by accident. You sent a letter to the house, the invoice thing, and Mom left it in a drawer. I saw it when I was looking for something. I thought you were gone." I shook my head. "Not gone, just misplaced." We talked for hours, quietly, cautiously, as if afraid too much warmth might break the spell. He told me about college, about wanting to be a teacher, about how the baby, my granddaughter, though he didn't use that word, was walking now. "She says Dada, but not much else," he said. "She's got your eyes, you know. Mom doesn't like when I say that." That made me laugh properly, and for a few minutes the years fell away. Before he left, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "I wrote you a letter," he said, embarrassed. I didn't know if I'd have the nerve to say everything. I took it, held it against my chest for a moment before tucking it into my apron. "You've already said enough," I told him. He hugged me, quickly, awkwardly, but real. When he walked out, I watched him cross the street and disappear into the fog, and for the first time in months, I felt the dull ache of hope. That evening, Joyce noticed my mood immediately. "You look like a woman who remembered something pleasant," she said, stirring a pot of soup. I smiled. "Maybe I did." She raised an eyebrow, but didn't pry. Later, in my room, I unfolded the letter. His handwriting was large, uneven, the way young men write when they haven't yet learned to conceal their emotion. It was simple, unpolished, and heartbreakingly honest. "I miss you. I don't know what happened, but I know it wasn't fair. I want to see you again, if that's okay." There was a phone number at the bottom. I read it 3 times, then folded it neatly and placed it inside my drawer, beside the folder marked Proof of Life. I didn't call that night. I wasn't ready, not yet. But the letter changed something. The wound that had scarred over began to feel alive again, not in pain, but in possibility. A week later, the mail brought something else. A thick envelope with a Wilmington return address. My daughter's handwriting. My first instinct was to throw it away, but I couldn't. Curiosity, that old betrayer, won. Inside were 6 pages of neatly written anger. She accused me of humiliation, of abandoning them, of traumatizing the family with my dramatic disappearance. She wrote that Lisa cried every night, that the baby, her baby, was growing up without a grandmother because of my pride. She never mentioned the airport, the too old remark, or the months of silence that came before. It was a rewrite, a performance. The letter ended with, "We're willing to talk if you're ready to be reasonable." I read that word again and again, reasonable, as if it were a knife disguised as courtesy. I folded the pages, slid them back into the envelope, and set it on the counter. When Joyce came in, she took one look at my face and said, "That bad?" I nodded. "That predictable?" She poured me a glass of something red and cheap. "Don't answer it," she said. "Not until you can do it without shaking." I didn't. I wouldn't. But the next morning, Kieran called. His name lit up on my phone, and before I could think, I answered. Grandma, he said, relief flooding his voice. I was hoping you'd pick up. I closed my eyes. I'm here, darling. He told me he'd read the letter too, that his parents were furious I hadn't replied. Dad says you're making a scene by silence. I smiled faintly. He's not wrong, I said. But it's the quiet kind. The kind that stays. He laughed softly, the way children do when they recognize something brave in someone older. Before we hung up, he said, I'm glad you're okay. I whispered, I'm better than okay. It was the truth. That night, I walked home under a drizzle that smelled like iron and pine, and for the first time in years, the air didn't feel heavy. Then, just as I began to believe peace might last, the second escalation arrived in full force. It began innocuously. A newspaper article forwarded to me by a customer at the cafe. Is this you? She asked, pointing to a grainy photo of me holding a pie dish at some forgotten family gathering. The headline read, Missing Matriarch. Family desperate for answers. My daughter and Aaron had given interviews, tearful and performative. We just want her safe, they said. She's vulnerable. We fear something's happened. I read it once, then again, until the words became absurd. Vulnerable. Missing. As though I hadn't chosen to leave, as though I'd wandered off into traffic. Heather found me standing behind the counter with the paper in my hands and asked quietly, You okay? I nodded. Never better. But inside, something burned. A slow, clean flame. I wasn't angry for myself anymore. I was angry for every woman who had ever been rewritten out of her own story. They didn't stop there. A week later, a man in a pressed suit showed up at the cafe after my shift. He waited until the last customer left, then approached me with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Harlow? He asked. My name is Derek Sorensen. I represent Adam and Lisa Harlow. They've asked me to ensure you're in a safe environment and to discuss some next steps regarding your assets. The phrasing was careful, rehearsed. My assets. My well-being. I realized they were trying to put me under legal guardianship, to claim I was incompetent, to protect themselves from the image of cruelty they had created. I folded my apron, set it on the counter, and looked him straight in the eye. Tell Adam and Lisa I'm not a lost pet they forgot to pick up. I'm a woman who decided to stop being treated like one. He stammered, trying to recover his professional tone. Ma'am, they're very concerned. Then they can be concerned from a distance, I said, walking past him into the afternoon light. Joyce found me that evening sitting on the porch, my hands steady around a mug of tea. You saw someone, she said. A lawyer, I replied. He came to make sure I'm alive. She chuckled darkly. You should have charged him for the confirmation. I laughed, and the sound came easily. That night, I wrote a short letter, not to Adam or Aaron, but to Lisa, the woman who had stood between me and my granddaughter that first day. I know what you did, I wrote, and I know what you didn't say. I'm not angry. I'm not coming back. Take care of your own life now. I've finally started mine. I mailed it the next morning with a stamp that had a small finch on it, the kind that sings even in the cold. I thought that would be the end of it. But guilt, like love, doesn't go quietly. 2 weeks later, she came herself. I was at the cafe refilling sugar jars when I saw her reflection in the glass. The polished coat, the cautious stance, the eyes darting toward me like a criminal approaching her own conscience. She waited until the rush was over before speaking. Martha, she said softly. The sound of my name in her mouth felt wrong. Too late. Can we talk? I didn't trust my voice, so I nodded toward the corner booth. She sat, back straight, as if posture could disguise remorse. "I didn't know Adam was sending that lawyer," she said quickly. "That wasn't my idea." "No," I said. "But leaving me at the hospital? That was." She flinched. "We panicked. The flight was boarding. The baby was crying. It wasn't like that." I smiled thinly. It was exactly like that. For a long time, she didn't speak. When she finally did, her voice was smaller, stripped of its performative poise. "I wasn't trying to replace you. I just didn't want your shadow in every room." There it was. The truth at last. Not cruel, but raw. I felt the anger drain out of me, leaving only clarity. "I'm not your shadow," I said quietly. "I'm your reflection. And you didn't like what you saw." She didn't respond. After a moment, she stood and left, her perfume lingering like a question I didn't need to answer. That evening, Joyce and I sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets. The air smelled of rain and wood smoke. "She came," Joyce said simply. I nodded. "And?" "And nothing," I replied. "She said her piece and I said mine." Joyce raised her mug. "To people who stop asking for permission." We clinked our cups together, and the sound felt like punctuation. That night, before bed, I took out Kieran's letter again, read it by the soft light of the lamp, and whispered, "Soon." The storm had passed, but not the lesson. Some endings don't arrive with fireworks or apologies. They arrive with a quiet understanding that survival itself is the victory. I realized I didn't need their acknowledgement anymore. The noise of their guilt would never drown out the calm of my own freedom. I had faced their rewriting of me and written myself back into existence, not as the missing, not as the fragile, but as the author of my own continuation. And that, I decided as I turned off the light, was worth more than any repayment ever could be. The morning of the hearing dawned pale and cold, the kind of day when the air feels like unspoken judgment. I woke before the alarm, as I always did, but instead of rising immediately, I lay there and listened to the sounds of the house stretching itself awake, the pipes rattling faintly, the slow creak of Joyce's footsteps downstairs, the faint purr of the cat pressed against the other side of my door. It was strange, that calm. After months of turmoil and avoidance, after the spectacle they'd made of my silence, I felt nothing but a still, deliberate certainty. It wasn't revenge that moved me, nor even anger anymore. It was something quieter, heavier, a need to finish a sentence that had been interrupted years ago. I had filed the claim not to win back the money, but to reclaim the meaning of it. I wanted the truth written somewhere that couldn't be erased by family gossip or polite rewriting. I wanted it on paper, stamped by a stranger who owed me nothing. Joyce insisted on coming with me. She said it wasn't about moral support. "I just like watching bureaucrats squirm," she claimed. But when she handed me a small thermos of coffee before we left, I caught the tenderness she tried to hide. "You don't have to do this," she said, as we walked toward the bus stop. "I do," I replied. "It's not about them anymore." She nodded, as if she understood, though neither of us spoke again until we reached the courthouse. The building was a square of dull concrete, its windows reflecting the overcast sky like a warning. Inside, it smelled of old paper and lemon-scented cleaner. People shuffled through metal detectors, clutching folders and exhaustion. I found my name on the docket board, Harlow versus Harlow, and something in me stiffened, as though the words themselves had drawn a boundary around my life. We waited nearly 2 hours before they called us in. The courtroom was small, more administrative than dramatic, with a worn carpet and a judge who looked as though he had long since lost interest in the concept of justice. My daughter was already seated at the table opposite mine, her lawyer beside her, his tie immaculate and expression confidently empty. She looked older than I remembered, thinner, her posture too rigid to be comfortable. Erin wasn't there. I wondered if it had been her choice or my daughter's, but it no longer mattered. I took my seat, smoothed my skirt, and placed my folder on the table. The judge glanced at the papers before him, sighed faintly, and said, "Let's begin." Her lawyer started first, of course. They always do. He spoke about misunderstanding, about family generosity, about the sanctity of gifts. He quoted sections of the Civil Code with the fluency of someone who had never been truly wronged. He used words like miscommunication and maternal distress, phrases that tried to sanitize everything ugly about what had happened. My daughter didn't look at me. She stared straight ahead, jaw tight, as if she were performing restraint for an invisible audience. When the lawyer finished, the judge turned to me. "Mrs. Harlow," he said, voice dry but not unkind, "you may respond." I stood, though my knees ached. "Your Honor," I began, and my voice surprised me. It was steady, neither pleading nor defiant. 3 years ago, my daughter called me asking for help. Not for advice, not for comfort. Help. Financial help. She said it was their last chance to have a child. I gave her everything I had. Not some of it. Everything. My savings, my pension, my husband's inheritance. I didn't call it a gift then, and she didn't call it one either. We both knew it was an act of trust, an exchange rooted in something deeper than money. I believed that by helping her bring a new life into the world, I would still have a place in it. I paused, not for effect, but because the truth always needs air to breathe. When that child was born, I wasn't allowed to hold her. I wasn't even allowed to stand close. I was told I was too old, too fragile, too unnecessary. And I accepted that humiliation quietly. But silence doesn't erase truth. It only delays it. What I am asking for today is not punishment. It's acknowledgement. That what was taken from me was more than money. It was trust. And when trust is broken, it's only fair to ask for something back. The room was very still. The judge watched me closely, his expression unreadable, while my daughter finally looked up. Her eyes were wet, but not in the way of someone who regretted anything, more like someone trapped in a narrative they'd written for themselves and now couldn't exit. When she spoke, her voice trembled just enough to sound sincere. "Mom, it wasn't like that," she said. "You didn't have to do any of this. You offered. It was love." I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said. "It was love. But love doesn't erase responsibility. You don't get to accept everything freely and then rewrite the story when it's inconvenient." The judge cleared his throat. "Enough," he said, not unkindly. He looked at the papers again, then leaned back. "This isn't really a case about money, is it?" he asked quietly. "No, Your Honor," I replied. "It's a case about dignity." He nodded, almost imperceptibly, and said, "I'll take it under consideration." We were dismissed. Outside, the air felt sharper, as if the sky itself had been scoured clean. Joyce handed me the thermos I'd forgotten on the bench. "Well," she said, "you made him listen." I smiled faintly. That's all I wanted. We didn't talk much on the way home. The world around us went on as if nothing had happened. Cars passing, people arguing into phones, pigeons pecking at crumbs on the sidewalk. But inside me, Something had shifted. The confrontation had burned away the last residue of illusion. There was no repairing what had been broken. There was only the quiet satisfaction of having told the truth out loud. A week later, the verdict arrived in the mail. The envelope was thin, unassuming, but my hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The judge had ruled partially in my favor. The justification was brief. Given the evidence and testimony, the court recognizes the financial transaction as a loan made in good faith. Partial reimbursement awarded. The amount wasn't much, certainly not the full sum, but enough to matter. A symbolic recognition. A footnote in an official record that said, I had not imagined everything. I held the paper to my chest, not in triumph, but in gratitude. For once, the world had named something I'd been carrying alone. When I told Joyce, she poured 2 glasses of cheap champagne she'd been saving for no occasion in particular. To small victories, she said. I laughed. To documented truth, I replied. We clinked glasses, and the bubbles caught in my throat, sharp and cold. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window with the verdict beside me, staring at the faint reflection of my face in the glass. It looked older, yes, but not diminished. I realized I didn't feel vindicated. I felt free. 2 days later, I received another letter, this time from my daughter. It was only a page long. I hope you're satisfied, it began. You got what you wanted. I hope it was worth it. There was no signature, just the faint mark of a tear on the bottom corner. I read it once, then set it aside. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I simply felt finished. I went to the drawer, took out the folder labeled Proof of Life, and added the court ruling to the stack. Then, almost on impulse, I removed the rest of the papers, the bank receipts, the invoices, the correspondence, and fed them one by one into the small fireplace Joyce used for winter warmth. The flames took them easily, curling each page into ash, until all that remained was a soft gray dust that looked strangely peaceful. I sat there for a long time, watching the fire fade. There was no audience, no applause, no forgiveness, just the steady hum of the world continuing. I realized that closure doesn't come from winning. It comes from choosing what to carry forward. I had carried this story for too long, its pain, its indignity, its desperate need for acknowledgement. Now it was time to let it rest. When the last ember went dark, I stood, closed the grate, and whispered, Enough. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the window. The air smelled faintly of smoke and rain. I dressed slowly, poured myself coffee, and sat by the window, watching people hurry past. Somewhere in another town, my daughter was probably getting ready for work, her child laughing in another room. Maybe she would think of me sometimes with anger, maybe with guilt, maybe not at all. But I no longer needed to imagine my place in her story. I had written my own. When I left for the cafe, Joyce called after me. You look lighter. I turned and smiled. I am, I said. I finally stopped holding on. It was true. The act was irreversible, like setting fire to the last letter you'll ever write. The past was still there, but it no longer defined the weight of my days. I had reclaimed my name, not the one tied to family or expectation, but the one spoken softly in my own mind, the one that simply meant woman, survivor, self. And as I walked into the morning, the city smelled of wet earth and new beginnings, and I thought, with a quiet certainty that startled me, this is what dignity feels like. The days that followed were not triumphant, only quieter. That was the real gift of the ending. Not joy, not sorrow, just an absence of noise. The world no longer tilted under the weight of what had been said or left unsaid. I woke each morning to the same creak of the floorboards, the same murmur of the kettle, but the sound no longer carried the undertone of waiting. Waiting for forgiveness, for a phone call, for something to rearrange itself into the shape of the past. Instead, there was only presence. It's strange how peace feels at first like emptiness, how it frightens you with its simplicity. I thought I'd feel lonely, but instead I felt spacious, like someone had finally opened a window inside me after years of stale air. I started to fill my days with small, practical rituals that anchored me to the present. Walking to the market every Thursday, tending to the ivy that grew stubbornly along the porch rail, polishing the small brass lamp in my room until it shone. These were not grand gestures, but they carried a rhythm that steadied me, a private liturgy of survival. The money from the court arrived a few weeks later, transferred quietly into my account. I withdrew half of it in cash, not because I needed to spend it, but because I wanted to feel its weight in my hands. It wasn't much, but it represented something beyond arithmetic. It was recognition rendered tangible, proof that I hadn't hallucinated my own worth. I placed the bills inside a small envelope and walked down to the community center, where a local scholarship fund was collecting donations for women returning to education after retirement. When I handed it to the coordinator, she blinked in surprise. "You sure?" she asked. "You could use this yourself." I smiled. "I already did," I said. She didn't understand, but she thanked me, and that was enough. Work at the cafe became easier. I no longer carried the ache of invisible grievance under my apron. Customers noticed. One of the regulars, a widow named June, began to sit with me during breaks, sharing stories of her late husband and the peculiar freedom that comes with grief. "It's like you finally have room to think," she said once, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "Room to remember who you were before you were someone's wife." I nodded. "Or someone's mother," I added. She smiled, eyes soft with recognition. We became friends in the way older women do, without ceremony, through shared silences more than conversation. Sometimes we'd take the bus to the coast on Sundays, walking slowly along the boardwalk, collecting smooth stones as if cataloging time itself. I began to write again. Not letters, not confessions, but small vignettes, memories of scents, gestures, and places that no longer existed. Writing was how I measured distance, how I learned to name the invisible terrain between loss and renewal. It was on one of those quiet afternoons that I received a message from Kieran. A simple text. "I'd like to see you again. No one needs to know." My heart didn't race as it might have months ago. I just smiled and wrote back, "I'd like that very much." We met at a public park halfway between our towns. He brought coffee in paper cups and a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked on the walk there. "They're not from a store," he said apologetically. "Good," I replied. "I'm not a store-bought kind of woman." We sat on a bench and talked for hours, our conversation circling easily through safe subjects, school, books, weather. But beneath it ran a current of unspoken truth. When he mentioned his little sister, he didn't call her the baby or mom's daughter. He said her name, softly, reverently. "I think she'll want to meet you one day," he said. I didn't answer, because hope, once broken, grows carefully. But the idea of it, a meeting not forced, not forbidden, simply chosen, was enough to warm the air between us. When he left, I didn't cry. I walked home with a sense of quiet fullness, as though something had finally realigned. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "Some bridges don't burn. They simply stop being walked on until the weather changes." I closed the book, set it aside, and realized I no longer needed to document every feeling to believe it was real. It was enough to live it. Winter came gently that year. The first frost covered the window panes in delicate lace, and the house smelled faintly of cinnamon from the tea Joyce had taken to brewing in big pots. We decorated the front porch with a string of yellow lights that flickered unevenly, but somehow felt truer than the flawless glow of the ones sold in stores. On Christmas Eve, she invited a few neighbors for soup and bread. There was laughter, wine, and a ragged rendition of old carols that made the cat retreat to the stairs in protest. I stood by the fire, watching the faces around me, ordinary people, imperfect, kind, and thought about how many years I'd wasted believing that love was something owed rather than shared. Joyce caught my eye and raised her glass toward me. "To new families," she said. I lifted mine in return. "To chosen ones," I replied. Later that night, after everyone had gone and the house had settled into its usual creaks and sighs, I stepped outside. The snow had begun to fall, soft and unhurried. I walked down to the end of the street where the lamplight pooled like honey on the pavement. The world was utterly still. I thought of the baby, now nearly 2, perhaps asleep somewhere far away, her breath rising and falling in the dark. I whispered a wish into the cold air, not for reconciliation, but for her to grow kind, not cautious, brave, not polished, capable of holding without fear. Maybe one day she would understand that the absence of a person doesn't mean the absence of love, that sometimes walking away is the last and truest act of care. When I returned home, I found Joyce asleep in her chair, the cat curled on her lap. I covered her with a blanket and turned off the lamp. Upstairs, the room felt warmer than usual. I sat by the window and watched the snow accumulate on the sill, erasing the edges of everything harsh. I realized then that peace isn't the opposite of pain. It's the quiet acceptance that both can live in the same heart without tearing it apart. I was still a mother, still a woman who had loved too much and been wounded for it. But I was also someone else now, not waiting, not proving, just being. If there's one thing I would tell another woman like me, sitting alone at her kitchen table, wondering when she became invisible, it's this. There's a life waiting for you outside the narrative you were given. It won't be loud, it won't be perfect, but it will be yours. Don't let the ones who called you too old convince you that your story is finished. There are still mornings to greet, soups to stir, strangers to smile at, oceans to see. There are still sentences left to write. And somewhere, in the quiet, there will come a moment when you realize that you have survived every version of heartbreak that tried to unmake you. That realization doesn't arrive like thunder. It settles softly, the way snow covers rooftops, patient and inevitable. I closed the curtain, turned off the light, and climbed into bed. The house hummed around me, alive in its smallness. I thought, just before sleep took me, that perhaps love, in its truest form, isn't about who holds whom. It's about who lets go without bitterness and still wishes the other warmth against the cold. And with that thought, I exhaled, the breath of a woman finally, fully her own.